On to our next presentation. This one's going to be about React Native. Another of our keynote guest speakers is Florian Rival, who is a software engineer and deputy CTO at BAM, a mobile dev shop in Paris, which uses React Native and Agile and Lean methodologies to create killer software. So here to talk to us about 30 months using React Native with 30 developers. Please give it up for Florian Rival.
Thanks. Can everyone hear me? That's okay? Okay, great. So thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here to talk about React Native. So first, let me introduce me. So my name is Florian. I'm working as an architect developer at BAM. We are making mobile applications for our clients. So ranging from small startups to big banking groups. So it really depends on the project. I'm also the developer of gdevelop. It's my side project. It's a game development software that you can use online or download. And its particularity that it's open source and that you can use it to create any game that you want without programming. And using it, I've created a game called Little Bulb Hello Earth. So it's a game where you control a cat, it's not a joke, going through the world to find the missing piece of his space pod, because cats come from space, of course. So you can find me on Twitter. If you have any question or if you want to reach me out, don't hesitate to reach me on Twitter or after the conference, of course. So I said React Native, so let's do a bit of introduction about it. So it was announced by Facebook in March 2015, and in fact it was already used by Facebook in production on iOS only, on an application called Facebook Ad Manager, and then it was used on other Facebook application. So it's a mobile application framework that is that enables us to create application using JavaScript and using React. And the big selling point is that it's cross-platform, meaning that you can, using a single code base, have your application on Android and iOS. We'll talk about this later. So the Android support was open sourced in late 2015. That's the time at which we started using React Native. It's a quite popular open source repository on GitHub. Lots of stars on it, the last time I've checked. So it shows a bit the good momentum that there is around React Native. What about the usage of React Native? It was used by Airbnb for part of their application, and then by Instagram, which is now part of Facebook, also for a few screens inside their app. So they've not started with React Native, but they have adopted it into an existing application. It was then used by Walmart, Bloomberg, Tesla. There is a showcase showing lots of great applications, and it was used by us with great success so far. So how it works, the idea between React Native is that everything that you're going to see on the screen of your application is a native component, just like a native application that you will be written, that you would write using Objective-C or Java. The difference is that every of these components are exposed by React Native, which is written in Objective-C or Java. And then React Native is embedding JavaScript engine, which is JavaScript core on iOS, and which is also JavaScript core on Android. And this JavaScript engine is powering your application that is written in JavaScript using React. It means that it's not based on web views, contrary to Cordova, also called PhoneGap, which is a cross-platform framework, but which is displaying everything on the screen using a browser. Here we have real native components. So React Native exposes native components, for example, views, text, or other specific components. And the difference between React Native and React.js is that React.js is working inside the browser and showing at the end HTML components. Here we have native components. If we dig a bit into how it works, you can see that there is the platform which is running your application. So this is a native application composed of 3 parts. The native part is the one I was talking. It contains a React Native code and also some native modules that you may want to create if you need. And then at the very top, there is the JavaScript application with some React Native APIs. And between the two of them, there is a bridge, which is the JavaScript engine. And also the bridge is the one that is issuing the native commands to create the interface of your application using native components. And so how it's working, in fact, is that every time you're creating a component in React Native, at the end, this component is sending over the bridge a lot of commands to tell the native parts to create the components. If now we look at the way your application is written in JavaScript, so you can write it in JavaScript using the latest flavor of JavaScript. So you'll not stick to an old version of JavaScript, so that's quite handy. And you can also use flow type or even TypeScript to have static typing, which is really great when you're used to a language like Swift or Java. So you can have both the safety of static, strongly typed language and the dynamic part of JavaScript. So as I said, React Native exposes native components, and it also exposes a lot of native APIs. For example, geolocation, the camera roll. A fun fact about the camera roll is that at the very beginning, it was only available on iOS. And when we started using it on Android, it wasn't available. So we had to code it in Java and expose it to JavaScript. So that was a bit of pain, but still now it's available directly in React Native. You can do unit testing with Jest or Mocha, or in fact, any JavaScript testing framework. Jest is made by Facebook, and it's quite fast and easy to use with React Native, so let's stick to it. And finally, there are some end-to-end testing solutions like Detox that are available, but as the application that you're creating is a native application, you can use Calabash or any other existing native solution to create end-to-end testing path. So that's how it works. And the question is why we started with React Native. When BAM was found, we started using Cordova, which was the best way to achieve the cross-platform dream. What we wanted from the very beginning was to only create a single application that was working on more than one platform. We want for our clients to have a single team developing their application and still be able to reach the iOS and Android market. In late 2015, we started 2 pilot projects with React Native. And 3 weeks later, we took a step back, look at it, and we were like, we should have stayed on Cordova. Why? Because React Native wasn't so much ready. We were having difficulties doing lots of things, for example, accessing the camera roll on Android. And still there was a few good points, meaning that we were doing React, so it was quite easy for any developers, and performance were good. So 3 weeks later, we also took a step back and looked at the situation, and we were like, let's use React Native for all of our apps. So far, so good. A few years later, we are now 50 people, and most of our apps are React Native. The rest are native, but with React Native inside. So what's so great with React Native? So that we are fully committed to it. First point, of course, you have a single code base. You have a single application to maintain. It's not really, it's really the case. We only have a single development team for all of our application, and there is about 90% of code that is reused between iOS and Android. The 10% remaining are either JavaScript code that you can specialize for a platform, For example, you have a component that you can change according to the platform. Also, in the 10% is native code that you have to do some time to bridge your application to a native SDK. Here is the structure of an application. So you have your JavaScript part, which is the 90% of your application, and there is the Xcode project and the Android project. So what you have are two native applications. You can do anything that you want with it, except that it's an application that is starting a JavaScript engine with your application. The second point is that with React Native, we have a native-like user experience. When we were working with Cordova, we had a lot of people telling us, that's okay, the application looks good, but still transition is not so fluid, and it does not feel like a real application, which is quite bad for a mobile dev shop. So with React Native, we have platform-specific UI components. Everything that is on screen is coming from the SDK of the system. So you can't make the difference. You have native mobile gesture. For example, you can push the switch and it's working. You don't have to recreate this component. They already exist. You have fluid transition, and you can have native effects like the ripple effect on Android, which comes free when you're starting. You're not forced to use CSS to do it again, and that's so much better. Another selling point is that the performance of your native of your React Native application is good. I mean, there is two separate threads to run the JavaScript code and the native code, meaning that if you're doing an EV computation in JavaScript, which you shouldn't be doing, but still can happen. In this case, it won't block the UI thread, meaning that your UI is always responsive. If you scroll a lot in a list, then you can still it is still smooth. Whereas when we were using Cordova, if the JavaScript was lagging at some point, at this moment your whole application is lagging, which is quite a bummer for most applications. So here is a screenshot of a profiler that you can open in React Native to see that your UI and JavaScript are on separate thread. And you can see here that we are not at 60 FPS because of I don't know what, but it's a good idea to launch it from time to time to see if you're running full speed. Another big selling point of React Native is the developer experience. I'm gonna try to show you how to start with React Native and what's so great or what are the pain points also before we finish. So concerning the developer experience, I would say that the learning curve is quite fast. Why? Because you can port most of your front-end web skills to React Native. It means that, for example, at BAM, we have a 3 weeks onboarding for a new developer, and turns out that on the first week, they are doing mostly JavaScript and React Native tutorials, and then the 2 other weeks are dedicated to working on a project, a React Native project with another team. And it's working well because all of our developers are doing this without any problem. The best is when you have a developer already familiar with React.js. In this case, in 1 week, you can be working on the application. You won't know everything that you have to know about mobile, but you're still able to do most of the tasks that you want, which is quite impressive compared to someone who would have to learn Objective-C and Java and the specific components of each platform. So that's what I'm saying. You don't need to learn specific mobile development skill, but you can get the skills as you work on the project. Native skills are still welcome to React Native. Here is a link to a good publication from Artsy. My slides are online, so you can get the links at the end. So it's explaining everything that you have to know. So it was written by a native iOS developer. So it's a good sign that React Native is well welcomed by native developers. If you want to get started with React Native, I would suggest to start with some great courses. For example, the one of egghead.io, which show most of what you want to know, And then what we do at BAM is that we encourage developers to share knowledge. We have this repository, which contains a lot of knowledge articles to, it's like tutorials or how-tos, which cover most of that, the topic that you want to know in React Native. Let's now speak about the development, the day-to-day development with React Native. First, the ecosystem is quite big. Most APIs that you want to use are already backed in React Native. I mean, this is an extract from the documentation of React Native, so you have access to lots of APIs from the mobile. And you can use Visual Studio Code, Atom or WebStorm, or any other text editors, VIM, and lots of them have integration with FlowType or TypeScript and Jest for testing. So at BAM, we are quite used to using VS Code. I was speaking of a large ecosystem with lots of reusable components. That's the big selling point of React, is that you can write your application using components that are reusable, and there truly are. I mean, lots of frameworks have been telling us that we can do reusable code. That was never the case. In fact, React was the first framework for me to achieve this. And the thing is that you have quite a lot of UI library that you can use to kickstart your application. In fact, at BAM, we've never used a lot of these UI libraries because it's still fast to start using the native components provided by React Native, but it's a good idea to try these anyway. Concerning the debugging, I think it's a huge point when you're starting with a new technology to see is the debugging easy or not, because you will run into trouble at one point. So how to do at this moment? There is a developer menu accessible into the application. So in fact, when you're running a React Native application during the development, you can check the device and this menu will show. So you can have a remote debugging with Chrome, and that's quite nice because everyone loves the Chrome debugger. It's still not as complete as web views or web development because, for example, if you can't use the profiler to profile your application using it. Concerning the native part, sometimes you have to deal with native tooling, so Xcode or Android Studio. For example, if you want to change the icon of the splash screen, and this is not too hard because the good thing is that you're not forced to search a React Native icon or splash screen on Google. You can just Google how to change my iOS application icon, and you will be able to use the same documentation because you have a native application, so you can change. You're not forced to do it the React Native way. By the way, we still made a script to automate this. Some word, if you come from Cordova or PhoneGap, it's easier when you're doing React Native to dig into native code. For example, integrating third-party SDK, because again, you can follow the same documentation as the native developers. It's the same concerning the development, for example, live reload or hot reload. That's a big selling point for React Native compared to native. You get hot reload, meaning that whenever you change a component in your code, React Native is bundling again your JavaScript and sending it to the application, and the application change only this component, meaning that it's fast. You don't have to reload the whole application, and the best part is that you don't have to recompile the whole application and wait for 10 seconds of compiling. It's still a bit harder to do development if you don't have a Mac. As you're creating mobile application, you should have a Mac. You can't avoid it. Some of our developers have started with doing only Android, but still you have to get a Mac to test on iOS regularly. Speaking of pain points, beware of the navigation. On native, navigation is done using the native SDK. Here we have much like 3 solutions to do navigation. The most used one is a JavaScript powered navigation. It's really customizable, and the only disadvantage is that it's not native, so it can you can see that it's not a native application. If you want to be sure that you're 100% native, go for React Native navigation, which is using the same component as native application. Finally, there is a third one, which is called native navigation from Airbnb. It allows you to embed part of React Native inside the native application, so you can have a native application, but with some parts which are powered by React Native. I will show you just after an example. It's still not maintained anymore, so we made a fork. Maybe we can become the maintainer of it later. So yeah, be sure to choose the right one at the beginning. It will shape your application a lot. Beware of platform inconsistency. I mean, React is learn once, write anywhere, but not run anywhere. You still have to test your application on both platforms. You still have to make sure that it's rendering the way you want, because some components are only for iOS, some other only for Android. So, for example, the shadow is handled differently on both platforms. The front rendering is also different, and some APIs are only for a platform. So be sure to always test on the both platform. What we have at BAM is that we have a device lab when we can get a device and test on it. Last point, React Native upgrades are still a pain. Why? Because React Native is a young framework. It's only 2 years, a bit more, 3 years now. So there is a new release each month, so it's moving a lot, JavaScript. But in the past, there was some breaking change into the native or JavaScript part. So my advice here is to always be aware of the latest change and don't wait for months to upgrade your application. It's okay on a small application, it's more a pain on a large application, of course. Let's finish by seeing some advanced usage of React Native. So the first one, embedding React Native inside a native application. Here is a quite well-known application that is composed of a part of React Native inside the application. So the big advantage is that the integration is really invisible for the end user, and you still need to onboard native developers. But what we've done here to integrate this, we are really proud of it, because users cannot see the difference between React Native and native. It wasn't the case with Cordova when we tried to do the same thing a few years ago. The project was a big failure. You can integrate third-party SDK quite easily. For example, here is a link to a module that we made to have notification coming from batch.com. There are modules for most of the most famous third-party SDK. The quality of this module are not well, it depends. So be sure to inspect and see what is the quality of the module that you're using. The last point that I wanted to talk about is, can I reuse what I'm doing in React Native for a web application? In fact, even using the same code. You can share all the business logic because you're writing JavaScript. So if you make a differentiation between your components that are for the logic and for the presentation, that's work. Same for the API calls. Same for everything that is making business rules. You can reuse the same modules, the same code base for both. It still requires adaptation for user interaction and everything related to routing, navigation, well, what is displayed on the screen, in fact. There is a project called React Native for Web, which aims to replace all the components of React Native by React.js components. You know, you see, we started with React.js, we created React Native, and now we're creating React Native for Web. Makes sense. So the idea is that with using the same code base, but I mean, without much adaptation, you have you have components that are rendered as native components when running in React Native. And when you're on the web, you're running Webpack or any other bundler, and you're telling this bundler to change your React Native module by React Native for Web, which is exposing the same components, but these components are implemented in terms of React.js components. Is it working? It is. It is. We even started a few open source modules to have more and more components, web views, Google Maps, Gradient, that will work across React and React Native, React Native and React Native for web. So it still need to be careful about what you do, but that's something that you can clearly do, and that's the best way to create a web application and application using the same code base. I think that no other framework was able to do this before. I think that's all. Thanks. As I said, you can find me on Twitter if you wish. My slides are online. So yes, thanks for your attention.
Many thanks to Florian. Are there any questions? We've got 3 minutes, so either one big question or two small ones. Okay, somebody in the back. Could somebody pass the microphone? Okay, I see it's coming.
Thank you. Okay, so say you're integrating a third-party service SDK, like Stripe or Facebook, and can you use the native version of that SDK, or can you use the web JavaScript version of that, or do you have to find a special version of that SDK just for React Native?
In fact, you're going to use the native SDK of your service. For example, so let's take Facebook. You had the Facebook SDK on iOS, and you had the Facebook SDK on Android. So you're following the same documentation as native developers. And then you have a third module, which is React Native Facebook SDK, which do the bridge between your JavaScript code and the two platform-specific SDK. So when you have a function in it, then you can, the bridge is calling this function. So at the end, you have the same interface in JavaScript, but implemented in two native modules.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I would call that a small question. So one last one, provided it's small. Okay, in the back.
Thanks. So with such a huge growing community and a lot of resources online, how do you judge them? I mean, how do you pick up the right one? Do you have some tips and tricks how to find and choose the proper forks or pieces of code on GitHub?
There are a few, there is, what's the name? It's called React Native Coach. There is a website, I can't remember the name, where there is a library of modules that you can use, and you can see the usage in terms of downloads, in terms of stars on GitHub. And that's not always easy to pick the right components, but you can quite easily differentiate between the one that is not used and the one that is really well used. So that's a good first metric. The other one, I guess, go and through the code base, see if you understand a bit, because that's the best way to see if it's a quality component or not.
Okay, I believe that answers that. Yes? Okay, great. So give it up once again for Florian.
Thanks.